All right, it's about 8 a.m. So we're gonna get going here, gonna get started. Our first presenter for the day is Anthony Waldrop. Anthony is a watershed restoration project manager for Grays Harbor CD, where he works to improve community resilience as well as water quality, water quantity, and habitat. Since 2018, Anthony's had the opportunity to implement projects ranging from low-tech assisted log structures with timber landowners to plantings and engineered log jams with the ag community. When he's not working on a district project, he enjoys playing, watching sports, recreating the Olympic mountains, and eating pizza. So,
yeah, thanks, Drew. Good morning, everyone. So my presentation is going to be about the many applications of live pole planting. So there's a lot of different ways that people throughout history have used live vegetation from cuttings, and there's, you know, whether that's in agriculture or in restoration work and all sorts of different species. So I'm going to give some recent examples of how we've been using live cottonwood and willow on the west side of the Cascades in Grays Harbor. But what's exciting is there's, you know, I'm sure there's many different ways that you all have been doing it as well, and lots to continue to learn and apply on the landscape. So one of the ways that, you know, we're looking at applying live pole planting is to reduce erosion, to get more root cohesion throughout the soil column. As you can see here, this is on the Satsip River. This is the landowner who has a cattle operation, used to provide beef to the Seattle Seahawks, really cool grass-fed beef operator. But as you can see, it's eroding, it's eroded through. You look at 1991, about a 200-foot buffer. So even if you do have root cohesion there, it's going to erode over time, especially in the third growth forest that was present there. But that landowner is going to work with us to help reduce erosion. And so we've been doing a design project to do engineered log jams to get a long-term solution going, but we also wanted to start a process of getting root cohesion throughout the soil column to maybe help reduce erosion and over the long term and see if we can get some vegetation established there sooner than later, and not vegetation that's just going to have roots right at the soil surface for the first few years and get undercut. So this is the design here that shows that you know, the river's flowing from top to bottom, and as meander bends do, they continue to lengthen down valley. And so this design involves putting in those engineered log jam structures and then a large riparian buffer plant. But as we know, with whenever you do a big project that involves machinery, it takes multiple years for permitting and design. So we wanted to do some early project actions so that we could, you know, even if some of them get taken out by erosion, some of the live poles, some of them will persist and continue to grow and develop root cohesion. So it was important to have good landowner communication in that as well, to make sure that we weren't overselling what we were trying to do. This is our very simple design here that shows how we were going to auger down about 2 to 3 feet with a single person gas powered auger, and then we used the pneumatic post pounder to get it down further down into the water table. We used 3-inch, about 3-inch diameter poles, and they ranged in length between 6 to 10 feet. And they were both cottonwood and willow, mostly cottonwood in that size. And then we did a spacing of about 10 feet in between them, and then about a 10-foot setback from the bank, because we did it during the winter and spring when the erosive flows were still happening and still possible. It doesn't erode it at every flow, but there's the potential for that if you get the right people. Like I said, this is a really good way to engage this landowner. You know, we've got a lot of really good landowner partners who are eager to have something done on their land. For some of these areas where you have erosion and you have funding to do a larger project, it can be frustrating for landowners to wait for the design and permitting and construction bidding process. And they don't necessarily see that work is being done. So this is a nice low permit or no permit action. We already had cultural resources done on this area, which was nice. Where we were able to get in there and do some project actions and have a sort of a dry run as well with the landowner, as far as getting access, bringing small equipment, coordinating with her, which acts as a good dry run for the eventual big construction when we're going to have to do a lot of coordination over a short period of time. And so this was a really good opportunity to get to know the landowner in a construction, in a low risk construction setting, so that we could continue to build that relationship into the bigger. This is our crew lead Jeff over here using the pneumatic post pounder, which is air powered, and installing those live poles as deep as we could get them. Some areas you can see are pretty gravelly, so we couldn't get those quite as deep, and I'll go into that a little bit more later. But some we could get in, what do you think, like 5 or 6 feet, Jeff? Yeah, about that. So nice and deep and pretty solid in there, and definitely enough through the soil column to get down to where the river would eventually be, if the river got to it, that there would be root cohesion. We implemented this in about as late in the winter as we could, so that we knew where the bank line was going to be, so that we didn't want to implement it in fall, because the erosive flows were there could be quite a bit more. So it was a nice low cost technique as well, and you know, it's essentially it's a planting. It's a little bit more robust with the planting. The post pounder we rented, and it was fairly cheap to rent for a couple weeks, and we really liked using the pneumatic post pounder because you can keep the air compressor at a staging area about 1,000 feet away, and then just run air compressor line to your project area. You know, it's wet out there during this time of year. We don't want to be running equipment damaging the soil or the grass that's there. So we were able to just have this cart that had the pressure regulator on it, and the post pounder that we would move around. So really nice tool both for this and for if you're installing post assisted log structures up in the hills. So we treated about a quarter of a mile. It was all crew work, and we also had a little bit of money to monitor and see how it goes. So you can see here, you know, it's part of the bank is the river's right up against the toe, and it's sawing the toe, and then here the toe is sort of protected by this gravel layer of it, this gravel lens that it's starting to expose. And so there's as the water went down in this area, we also put a bunch of willow stakes in this gravel lens to try to get them established in this area where there's more underneath ordinary high water. Because what we've seen on the south of many of our rivers, you get willow that comes through, cottonwood that comes through and establishes on these bars. The thicket they create builds that soil back up. So the more that we can mimic that, the better. And that's what we're trying to do as much as possible. So another great benefit of this is these poles were really low. They were no maintenance essentially. They were competitive right away to any invasive plants that were on the site, whether that was canary grass or pasture grasses or thistles. They competed with them right away. They had access to water deeper than those plants did, and then they continued to grow over the summer while the grasses died off, and were able to outcompete them. This is a project, a more recent project, so that what I've been talking about, we implemented 2 years ago, and I'll show some more recent photos of that. This one we implemented a couple months ago on a site that WDFW owns, that's all reed canary grass. And this was more of an experiment for us where we wanted to put in a bunch of these poles, not do any maintenance on it, and see if we get a forest of cottonwood and willow just from no maintenance. We have a lot of wetland vegetation areas that are dominated by reed canary grass that have very low diversity. So if we can have this as a viable technique, no herbicides, where we can get some shade established and then start to build off from that to added diversity, and that would be a really great tool for us in some of these reed canary grass areas. Really easy augering and post driving and in this area, which was nice. This is that planting from last week. So you can see in most of the poles are covered by the reed canary grass right now, which is fine. We're going to be seeing, hopefully over the course of the summer, our poles will continue to grow. The reed canary grass will go through its life cycle and become less and less dominant, and then the poles will get up and above the reed canary grass. So that's the hypothesis. We'll kind of see how it goes, but I'm optimistic about it. Another great application of live poles, an even bigger material, which I'll get into here, is they can, if you have regular overtopping flows that go over a pasture or go through a floodplain planting, if you have those poles that approximate what a riparian forest does and acts as a catcher's mitt, that can be really valuable to build that riparian fringe back up. When you have an eroding pasture, that fringe is gone, and so all that material goes across the field, and it can be a big issue for people who are managing that land agriculturally, or if you have riparian plantings, it can destroy the riparian plantings if there's big enough wood going through that system. So on the left here, those are Douglas fir, those aren't live poles there, but this acting as a catchment. And then we've got one of our live poles in the winter helping to capture woody debris and deposit it along the riparian fringe. This project we did last winter with using salmon recovery funding on the Chehalis River. And this, instead of using Douglas fir, we used live cottonwood, about 15 foot long and about 12 to 18 inches in diameter. And we were able to get a great contractor to install these with a vibratory post installer. Really quick, really easy. So the river flows from right to left, and it goes, when the water comes up on the Chehalis, a lot of debris gets lifted up and goes across that field. And the landowner was really interested in establishing a riparian buffer, but he actually came up with this idea independent. He was talking with me, he's like, I want to build a catcher's mitt. And I was like, that's great, we can do that, but let's make it something living. And he was very excited about that. The hardest part of this project was working with the contractors to find a harvestable native cottonwood source. And so that was a big learning opportunity, but we were able to get there, and ended up being about, based off the bids we got, $500 per post installed. So we're hoping to get that price down with more competition and having good sources identified, because that was the main limiting factor. But it was a really good pilot project, and the contractor was really good to work with. This is a couple of weeks ago where we got sprouting, and we had to protect them from the beavers because they started to have some really expensive snacks once we installed them. But we put welded wire fencing around all of them, which was very inexpensive, fairly easy to do. But we're excited about this. We also were able to do a little bit of harvesting from on-site of some cottonwood that the landowner had. And that was really fun for the contractor. You know, it was very minimal disturbance, and we created somewhat of a Dr. Seuss forest with all these different branches and things. And so it was a really good way to engage the contractor and help them understand some of the value in this wood that the community sees as not a valuable wood product. And so we're hoping as we work with the contractors that we're able to, that they can be our front line of identifying sources of it, and so that we can use it on a lot of projects. We also did live poles on this project area. This is, go back real quick. So you can see on the right side, that's where we did the large poles. On the left side, we did these smaller ones because the flows, the debris doesn't come up and over those. So we just, but there is still erosion issues there. And so we did the smaller poles, which our crew installed, which has been doing really well. And the landowner, very restoration minded, painted them with sand, and that's been really good for keeping the beavers from munching on them. So another great application of this, kind of self-apparent, is that it results in pretty rapid riparian vegetation establishment. See if I can get this. Whoa, there it is. It's like you have to threaten it.
Yeah.
So a lot of our waterways that don't have vegetation, that need it for shade, are where we can do projects that get native vegetation established quickly and get that shade quickly is a valuable tool. So some of the poles from last year grew to about 8 feet with their longest shoot, a lot of stems, and they had a very encouraging start to their life there as far as establishing a quick riparian buffer. And the goal here is to get these early successional species established in some of these harder areas to get plants established, like in the pastures. And then we can go in later and use some of the microclimates that are created through the shade of these early successional species and get the longer lived and the diversity of shrubs and conifers on this space. So this kind of helps create that foothold that they naturally do. And then we don't want to create just a cottonwood and willow forest throughout the county, but it's a way of working with that successional planning. So we were really happy with the survival on these. It was over 80%. Yeah, they were competitive. There was no real survivability difference between species or the pole diameter or length. The real survivability difference was how deep we got them in the substrate that they were in, which if you've worked with live vegetation before, that's pretty consistent with what people have experienced. This is from last week. There's continued really good vegetative growth. Landowner was really happy with it. And even though she lost a little bit of production area, which she was losing through erosion, she's very happy with it also because it helps reduce people from the river clambering over the bank and come onto her property. So the survival was largely driven by access to water. The gravelly substrate, we weren't able to go very deep, and also the water availability there disappeared really quickly. We had a really wet spring last year, and that helped a lot of poles put on growth, and they were really happy through June. And then once that tap turned off, they dried out because they couldn't access water where they were that they could before. So if it was driven at least 4 feet below ground surface, those were the most successful at surviving and also thriving. So the deeper we were able to get, the better they were able to succeed. So this is just kind of hard to see here, but the things that we were monitoring were how deep we were going with the auger, how deep the final depth was after post pounding, if there was any girdling or that happened from using the post pounder, and if that made a difference at all, the soil conditions, and then how healthy they are, just subjective, the length of the longest stem, number of stems. And so it was pretty clear from the early monitoring results that the main variable that was the limiting factor was that substrate and the depth. There was just some sections where it's like, yep, those was just not surviving there. And then, back to the thought on erosion reduction, we always pitch this project as it's going to reduce erosion, but it's not going to stop erosion. It's not going to be we're telling landowner, like, this is just the first step in getting more root cohesion on this landscape. And it's probably not going to be a noticeable erosion reduction if the river gets to it and starts to chew away at it. It's hard to see if it will have major erosion reduction, but we know that any vegetation we get established that's got deeper roots, it's got more robust roots, and if it grows over decades, we'll have a good head start on holding things together. So that's why it's really important for me and for our team that we've got these multiple benefits that we can talk to the landowner about, talk to the funders about, and we can also, if it is an erosion issue, we can work to have a longer term solution in the works. So as far as lessons learned, that it's definitely been a viable maintenance technique. If we're thinking that if the posts aren't going down that deep, to maybe thin the stems so that it has less to support during the drier part of the year. There was no real difference between the cottonwood and the willow that we were using. The ideal size of material for driving was 2 inches to 3 inches. Even a 2-inch in diameter, 6 to 10 foot long pole, we were a little worried that it might be bowing too much while we were driving, but it was fine, which was great. Working with your local suppliers is good to get a good lead on that material, because sometimes it can be harder to find those longer poles. And it's been great for landowner engagement, drought tolerance, and we got that longer term project that we're working on as well. There's truly Jeff right there, smiling away. So just want to thank the funding department of the Shayla's Basin Strategy Erosion Management Program that funded this as a pilot project. The landowner, we had some help from the WCC crew, our own crew, and then our supplier, Salix Solutions. So we're continuing to just grow a lot of live vegetation at both erosion issues, at areas that have a lot of weed pressure, but it's encouraging that we're getting these results and getting funded to continue to do this in our long-term planting projects. So, any questions? Yeah, Jacob.
Thanks, Anthony. Well, first off, I want to say, if anyone here take the boat down and go to the middle section of the Saturday, I encourage it. First, you get to flow by the Anthony, Grace Conner, others. I had a question about the larger cottonwoods, and wondering if that $500 figure per state you were mentioning, is that cost of procurement and labor, or was it just the contractor fee for installing?
Can you say that?
For larger cottonwoods, they're usually more so for jams and catching. Was that $500 figure procurement and labor, or just for all?
That was procurement, labor, it was all kind of wrapped in together as bid items. I think we only had 2 or 3 bid items, which was, just access, establishment, and then number of poles installed. So we originally thought that we could do a lot cheaper based off some other projects that we were looking at. But with the timeline that we had, some of the contractors that were gonna be cheaper, they just couldn't find the cottonwood. And so I think in future projects like this, I'll probably do more of the work on the front end of trying to find the cottonwood. Because we wanted to restrict it too, like you can find hybrid poplar stands that people will let you harvest. And we at least for this, especially this pilot project, we didn't want to use those. But anywhere that you're harvesting cottonwood is usually wet within a floodplain near a river, and so there's more restrictions around where you might be able to harvest that. So we had some opportunity to do limited harvest on the landowner's piece, but a lot of those cottonwood were a bit too big for their machinery. And so yeah, that is an area where we're hoping to learn a bit more so we can get that price down. But what's nice with this is it's a scalable project, so even though we weren't able to do as many poles as we originally thought, we were still able to do the extent of work and then use funding to continue planting behind it. Yeah, Brian.
So, congratulations. I was trying to get some craft projects to do this pre-COVID and it didn't take it. So kudos to you guys for taking it on. Eastern Washington, pay attention because pole plantings are similar to techniques done in areas like Mexico, Arizona. Because these poles get down to the water table through. One of the issues in the Palouse doing riparian work is you get an occasional ice storm, ice flow every 5 years that wipes everything out. Pole would be your armor to prevent those from getting wiped out. Wanted to think about that. And last, my question for you, Anthony, did you see a difference between the ability of the trackable mounted counter versus the handheld counter to get poles deep? Like your gravel sites, if you couldn't get deep enough with the handheld, could the trackable have gotten down through that gravel?
We didn't try a trackable one, so that.
Was it obviously becoming better? Than the handheld?
Oh, you mean like the
Could you?
the excavator?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, those were that project site where they were using that one. It was pounding was really easy both for the excavator mounted and our pneumatic one that we use because the depth of the alluvium it was really deep.
Okay.
So that project on the Chehalis had pretty easy driving. I think if we had been able to do the excavator mounted on the Satsop site, which had all the gravel in some certain areas, we definitely would have gotten deeper. But it put more stress on the poles. I'm not sure if that would have. Yeah, and so it's and also the access would have been, it's a much wetter site. And so that's a challenge when doing this in the floodplain areas and doing it when the vegetation is dormant.
Is there a window of opportunity when the site is dry enough, pole will basically sit there until they get wet?
Yeah.
So there'd be an opportunity in the drier time to get the equipment in and then let the pole sit there until the spring and water gets flooded back off.
Yeah, so it's kind of that dance with, the access and how much impact you want to have. And the Chehalis site was well drained enough that getting equipment out there and we were able to keep impact down. But yeah, that's where I like where we have a lot of capabilities with our crew. They can go out there with just their feet and get stuff in without a real big sloppy mess. Because once you get that track equipment going a couple times, it's a big impact. And I don't know, Jeff, if you have any thoughts on drivability. No. Yeah.
Did you notice a difference in diameter of the poles, the fact that it's survivability?
Not as far as I could tell right now. I think in the literature, it's like the bigger you get, the less survivability you get. Is that right? Or maybe it's just more expensive, but I haven't seen a difference between 2 to 3 inch all the way up to 15 inch. They're all sprouting and growing. One thing I am curious about is where are the roots growing in the soil column? Like, are they growing in a certain area of the soil column so that, you know, if the river were to get to them, you don't have roots all the way down to where the pole is? When we do construction on a larger project, we'll get an opportunity, I think, to remove some of these and be able to look at where are the roots growing, where are we getting that vegetation. And I also want to experiment too, so that site particularly when it would flood, the soil would sort of roll back, and that's how they lose a lot of their bank line. So in future projects, I want to bury some poles laterally as well, so that we can get we get the deep stability and then the stability laterally more quickly. Yeah, right.
Are you guys doing any erosion rate monitoring? As in take the pre-project and raise pre-project compared to take with a rate post-project over time?
You know, we are not doing anything that extensive for that particular project. I think we're just mainly keeping track of the aerial images and the drone images that we're taking. So we're doing fairly regular drone flights that we can yeah. And so what was the monitoring you're saying?
Basically stretch a tape from the existing edge of water.
Yeah.
Edge of bank back and just look at rates over time.
Yeah.
Every year, 6 months, and then follow it as it comes into the buffer and watch.
Yeah.
Hopefully, ideally, theoretically, watch that rate slow down for 90.
Yeah, yeah. And so I think we have enough baseline data to monitor that based off when we put it in and then how it's been progressing. So but you're right, it is part of the story. But I get very nervous about saying, yes, we reduced erosion. But yeah, I think it will help. Any other questions? Yeah, sure.
The poles that you were pounding in with the handheld, how big were they, like diameter?
They were about 2 to 3 inches. Yeah.
Were they like break any of them while you're doing that?
I don't think so. No, we didn't break any. They held up really well, and especially because we augered in a lot of the depth, so you've already got a lot of pull down, and until you start grinding for another foot or two.
Did you chop the tops off with that, or did it?
We did chop, yeah, good, yeah.
Flat and flush.
The most damage on the poles was just in that top 1.5 where the actual pounder tools in.
Yeah.
There's just a lot of board, so some of them would split or be rubbing up against the side and that should grow part of the tree. But most of the top we did trim down.
Okay.
Even ones that were girdled are still growing too, or moderately growing. Yeah, so it's they can, you know, they're used to being tumbled through a river and getting buried by a gravel bar and then growing. So I think they're pretty resilient, which is nice.
We have a gas part under, and sometimes within the post, it just kind of like.
Yeah.
Things like that.
That's one where you got
Yeah, it's not a huge one, though, it's, you know, one person can do it, but I thought about using that.
the pneumatic one is so nice because it's much less work and much less tiring for the crew, because you put it on the post and then you just hold the post and then there's a trigger. So no one is holding the actual 50-pound piece. So it's much more sustainable than using the gas powered one where you're just shaking, you know, after it. So highly recommend the pneumatic one if you can can find it. Oh, should I?
Okay, you mentioned literature earlier in response to another, question.
Yeah, there's, I don't have anything off the top of my head, but just there are examples of live pole plantings, usually from arid areas, that I was able to draw some information from to hold a bit of the background. But yeah, people have been using these techniques for a long time. Yeah. Jacob? No, okay.
What do you expect to be the timeline before going in and adding those other species?
So we're going to be, so for the big cottonwood poles, we already have added plants in and around those because we knew we weren't gonna do construction there. Because the erosion on that spot was pretty minimal. The main issue was that debris flow. So we planted in and amongst it. For the SATSA project, we're doing construction next summer. So after that, we'll kind of see how things have settled out, and then kind of look at our grant timeline, because most grant timelines don't go 10 years. So, but if we have a 5-year timeline for it, we can strategically figure out how do we best sequence what we're planting and when you're planting it, and try to have those microsites with a little bit of shade, maybe some large wood that provides some natural mulching effect.
Did you have to apply for any local, land permits like shoreline and floodplain?
So for the smaller poles, where it was just our crew, we did not need any permits for that. It was just, we talked with all the permitters and it was like, hey, we're doing this planting, we're augering, we're pounding down. But we weren't touching the water, we weren't impacting wetlands. For the larger one, because we had equipment going next to the river, we went through a bunch of back and forth with WDFW, and they eventually, I think, determined that we didn't need a permit, but I'm not sure if that's what would happen the next time, because they were also like, well, if it's intended to interact with the river at some point, but eventually they came around to, oh, it's just a planting. And so that's what was nice. It's like, it's just a big live stake planting and the equipment's not going in the water at all. So they came around to it. The shoreline, the county was, saw it as a planting, didn't see it as an impact that needed permitting. So I think, yeah, as long as you're pitching it as a planting and you're being really clear with folks as to what you're doing, you can usually, at least in Grace Harbor, get the blessing, but that early coordination is important because you do, especially with the big ones, you have equipment next to a river and people are going to ask questions if they see it. So, but I think it's a nice technique to have a low permit or no permit action. Yeah, but definitely getting the cultural resources figured out sooner than later is important, because you are potentially doing a lot of ground disturbance. What was interesting, we had in our bid documents, we told the contractors they could either auger in place or they could use a vibratory post cutter. We kind of want to leave it up to them. But because there was the option of doing augering, we did a pretty extensive cultural resources, which was really great that SRF funding was very supportive of that cultural resource work. But then our contractor ultimately just slipped them into the ground. So if we had augured, we would have needed a archaeological monitor on site as soil was coming up, but we didn't have any soil coming up. It was just placing it down. So, but we were trying to be prepared for all those different pathways. Yeah. Yeah, true.
I never missed this, but found in other species besides cottonwood, other willow species or?
So yeah, we, Schooler's willow, Pacific willow, any sort of willow mix that was, had a long enough, sturdy enough shoot, we were putting in there, and they did great. Yeah.
We got about 10 more minutes if you have other questions or comments.
Yeah, like, just kidding. Think if there's any other.
Keep track of like the post numbers, do you have like a little tag on that or something?
We had, sort of our, you can see here, post number, front 110, front 111, and then we had little stakes in the ground that said, this is where, 110 and then 120.
Oh, that's nice, you don't have to see.
Yeah, so we didn't stake all of them. Those stakes are kind of low to the ground, so they're hard to find sometimes, but yeah, that helped because we were able. We put them all in and then came back and did all the measurements and things. But they're quickly becoming too tall to measure how, with the tape, so. Yeah, I mean,
Do you remember how much the willow and cottonwood poles cost?
poles. Let's see, I do have a price. Oh. So 350 and they were about $5,000 for those. So yeah, I'm not sure how that works out math wise, but pretty affordable.
$14-50 each.
Yeah. What's I gonna say? Oh, I'm curious what experience other people in this room might have with live vegetation planting or using different techniques to get them to get holes or stakes deeper. I know, Kiana, you guys use a water stinger, right? And that seems to work out pretty well. But yeah, just curious if anyone has different experiences or things that they're trying.
Yeah, I've used just like a soil probe here and there to put in either bundles, smaller minnow stakes where I put in, 20, 20, 30 per hole, or just the larger ones. And I've gotten pretty good survival. I've got some that are pretty far away from the water, the water table.
How deep does that probe go?
Well, I think I've got down about 7, 8 feet.
Wow.
Is
Is that like a screw type thing?
Right. And I've gotten Pacific peach leaf to grow pretty well, so 50 feet from the water.
That's great.
Seems to be working pretty well, so I'm really curious to try. I had done some larger cottonwood with a handout 4-pounder, and I just did a few at a few different project sites, and the beaver rate them in like the weeks. I didn't get to see anything of that.
Yeah, in areas of like high beaver pressure, you guys ever just like bury the stake completely and just go from, I'm curious to try that out, especially in areas where the river comes up and can pop them out. So just, usually there's, a portion of the stake up, but I'm not sure how necessary that is with these species.
I've tried that and mixed results. Because I haven't seen it.
One thing that's been successful for us where there's high flows for a lot of the year, very difficult access, is we have sort of chased the water level as during the spring, because for us, we don't have a spring freshet, the water just keeps going down after usually April. And so what we did on some projects is we'll put in row stakes on as the river kind of moves down, and then we try to get them down into that water table, and then we come back and do a little bit more and do a little bit more. And, you know, that's not gonna be as successful as doing it during the dormant season, but it's the only time we can really get in there and do it. And, I am more curious to do, especially with that, to just do the burying type technique because, you know, you walk around our gravel bars and you see long straight lines of cottonwood shoots coming up. It's like, yeah, there's a big branch down there. And the more we can mimic that, the more we're working with the material we have.
Great, well, thank you so much.
Yeah,